Suzuki Salma from Tunisia, Mediterranean. I'm an Arab, I am a Zig, I'm a Moor. I'm all those cultures that they put into my culture with capital C. I'm also a migrant myself. I'm a newcomer to Spain. The first thing that caught my attention was in Spain, the resoluteness in Spain to not to stress the value of its own culture, even musical culture. I guess how come a country at the junction of two continents, of West and East, that's become the gate of South American culture into the region, invests so much into decreasing its own energy. This shows in its musical identity, where there are gaps, where there is no memory, no understanding, where there are deficits. When making the agenda for this speech, I'd like to stress how much value Spain has diminished and totally swept away. The sub-Saharan African heritage has been cancelled in Spanish musical culture. Let's talk about flamenco. Honestly, I feel that flamenco is a specific answer to questions related to Spanish musical identity. In order to dwell on it, I've invited dancer Yinka Esi Graves, ethnomusicologist Núria Domènech, and journalist Rahmata Dem Njie. Thank you very much, girls, for being here with us. Mensaiko. I leave you with my partners. Good afternoon, everyone. Those of you on site, those of you online, welcome to the speech Insumises, Flamenco, a Black Memory. I quote Suzuki, flamenco comes from a cultural junction. We are acquainted with the gypsy, the Arabian culture, but we don't talk about that possible junction between flamenco and black sounds and how it is embodied in gestures and music. Here, professionals will dwell on this issue. Amongst them, Núria Domènech, a musicologist. Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Rahmata, for inviting my input. I'm an ethnomusicologist. It looks very academic, but actually it's very human in nature. And in the speech, I'll dwell on these cultures that apparently have been considered distant and are closer to us. Online, Yinka, flamenco dancer, choreographer. Hello, Yinka. Hi. You there? Thank you for inviting my input to this speech. It's my pleasure to have a talk with you here. Let me start with a question for you to answer in this conference, which is, let's say there is a big link between music and history, between flamenco and Spanish history. Especially, yes, that's it. Essentially, music and history go hand in hand together. In Spain, anywhere in the planet. This is so because if language for us is the reflection of a culture of music, it's the reflection of a specific time in history, in a specific place. So, currently in Western Europe, we consume music for entertainment purposes. Music and history, however, go hand in hand together. Yinka may dwell on it. What do you think, Yinka? Yes. Let's start with my experience. I entered flamenco after a discovery of mine. I do like what Núria said. When I started to be taught in England, innocently, I didn't know what it implied. And my trip to Spain later, I started in Barcelona, then I moved to Madrid, next to the south, and I was spent in Seville some 10 years. And it's taught me that it's impossible not to face the history of the same spaces where something's being created. This something I've found that came new to me. When I started this trip innocently, I didn't realize, even if I graduated in art history, and all pictures merit a historical framework, but this happened to me and flamenco because I went to the places in Andalusia where flamenco was created, was born. Yes, I feel for you, and I understand you. For many years, there's been talk about this possible black memory, black legacy in flamenco. For instance, Gurumbe, the documentary, with inputs from Yinka, depends into this heritage. Let me ask you, why do you think there is such a refusal, denial of a possible black input or legacy in the history of Spain? It's complex to answer. Yinka, please, since you input into Gurumbe documentary, it is a must watch. I laugh because it's, as you say, how can I answer this question? I feel that several things go together. Let me tell you that I'm a foreigner, therefore, sometimes it's difficult for me to take a stance versus the ways things are done in a country. But I've spent some 15 years in Spain. And I think that, as it happens with many things in history in Spain, which is very complex and simultaneously actually so full of different pieces coming together. A long time, I think there's been an attempt to pretend that there has been no immense diversity in Spain. So the issue of how it is perceived, how things African are perceived and felt, ways of doing things, African people, the way they are perceived is a global issue. I've been dwelling on that for a while, and I think that generally speaking, since the beginning of a time in history, which is the slave trade, living from Africa to the West, to the Indies, as told by Gurumbe documentary, falling back on archives and historians, the legacy of Spain, of Portugal as well. At that time, a relation started with African people, which is sort of destruction, robbery, followed by colonization that increased that feeling that what comes from Africa, even it's actually valuable. Let's think about minerals that are in technologies we usually use right now, wood, raw materials, gold. It's been a sort of extraction-based relation. So when it's time to assess, to size the legacy left by a community that did input into it, when we talk about things African, we think these things are so far away from us, but we talk about people who were with us for 4 centuries, sharing our territory, Spain. Namely, it's impossible thinking that they left nothing behind them. In other places, African children have enjoyed a substantial legacy. This is related to this impossibility to assess, to size, to cherish what comes from this continent. It is a global issue. In Spain, since this story is muted, it's even impossible to approach it. It's hidden. I totally agree with Yinka on it. I think that this legacy we drag a thought created in the 15th century when the Spaniards met the Africans for the first time ever, and we drag from then stereotypes and derogatory connotations related to things African, either people or music, dancing, culture, expressions. Therefore, since it is not voiced, it's not identified, it becomes a sort of racism embedded in our culture, which is in each one of ourselves. However, it goes unnoticed. It's invisible. Even people who don't suffer from it, there are people who aren't either aware of that or don't want to realize. There are even people who deny racism. So how come? Since we don't want to rethink, to re-engineer, to rediscover our own history, how come we're still dragging under the weight of these colonial thoughts related to things African? I quote Yinka. We consider it alien, far away, distant, outside us, and this heap of things make acceptance of this African legacy being different for someone who considers it distant, outside him or her. It's interesting what you said, Yinka. Let me quote it. Because for 4 decades with African presence in the south of Spain, for instance, Seville had a 15% of population of blacks, a datum that is unknown, and it's a substantial number. Now let's switch to a film, short clip by Javier Padilla, El Negro Mary. That's his nickname. Jacinto Padilla, nickname Negro Mary. This is the first film we have of a Negro dancer recorded in 1900 Paris exhibition shot by Brothers Lumiere. This leads me to my next question. Let's say that this African legacy is accepted by the world of flamenco. Please, Yinka, answer. Am I right? Núria said something very powerful that I think related to this film. And your question, Rahmata, which is the case of invisibility, of going unnoticed, because it's related to where are things black in flamenco. People trying to look for something, screaming at them, I'm African, in a step or in a song, a flamenco song. I think Núria said that we are approaching something that is ephemeral in nature and difficult to grasp, to size, to see, according to the regard you have about it. This film you showed, my first contact with that video was some years ago. I don't talk about that experience because for me it frames this case for me. It was a conference on flamenco and cinema. We were celebrating these shots. The first time a flamenco ensemble is filmed. And for many years, up to 4, 5 years ago, Jacinto Padilla, everyone thought he was Maestro Otero, who was a big teacher and dancer of Seville in the late 19th century, early 1900s. When I attended the conference, they say, this is Maestro Otero dancing, I don't know what. I'm sure this is a Negro on the screen. And my memory of Maestro Otero was something totally different in carriage, with a totally different style of dancing. He was a bolero-like dancer, not so much being an acrobat of flamenco, a celebration-like acrobatic stance of Jacinto Padilla in the video. And never, after talking about the relevance of the video, they never said he was a Negro. And only when Kiko Mora, a researcher, expert in Spain and cinema and flamenco, went to the archives, to the repositories, and said, no, this man's Jacinto Padilla, a bullfighter, a guitar player, a singer, flamenco singer, and also he was a sort of a hooker. And many flamenco artists were hookers at the time. And I went, wow, this man was theoretically showing normality in flamenco. This is a flamenco ensemble. His Negro character, his Negro persona was totally unseen until Kiko Mora told us that, according to archives, Maestro Otero had never been to Paris back then. And he said, this man's another one. He's not Maestro Otero. I think it's very interesting. Before us, it's impossible. Or someone is invisible, even if he is in front of us, if he is in front of us. Back to your case, Rahmata, that's the case. There is a sort of subconsciousness. Many people who aren't able to name it, something that rings a bell in their minds, but it is not something straightforward accepted. Why? Because of what we say now, they need to reshape what theoretically may be African in the territory of Spain. And re-watching it, that's the work incumbent upon us to do. That will help us open this field still to be approached, because there are people who talk about it now, some people, but I think it is a big, immense field for us to examine. But it should be done from a standpoint trying to have a different look at it. Back to what you said, Yinka, I realize this subconscious is fed by having one single valid, relevant history, one single image. It's as if current Spaniards only had one history, and this history counted out absolutely such critical facts as that African people, African children lived in Spain for many years. And projects such as Gurumbe are really real opportunities for us to rediscover, reread, rewrite a history, more aware of it, so that we all partake more of this history instead of just someone deciding that this part, let's cancel it. Let's say then that projects such as Gurumbe helped open this debate on this issue. Yes, I think so. It helped raise our awareness to be responsible for it. Absolutely. Miguel Angel Rosales, the director of the film, I think he was very big when he surfaced many people dealing with this topic for many years from the academic world who don't reach out, people in the street. However, I don't know whether it's ever been shown on Spanish TV. I think it's still sort of dormant, though many people have seen it. It's not that everyone is saying it is a must to see, it is a must to see. I quote Núria. She's right, in as much as that, let's stress it, because it's important. It is a piece. I think that looking for a history, because now people say, oh, so flamenco is black. No, that's not it. The message we'd like to convey is that flamenco might have been born, I did like that word, given away to us at the beginning by Sasuke, junction, because this is real in places where things are created. They are junctions, crossroads. I think that the idea of a community, gifted community with art, who have the gift of art as it is conceived or dreamt of. A flamenco as something typical of the gypsies, who are the big torch bearers, carriers of flamenco. There is no doubt about it. It's out of question. Transmitters, they are transmitters. Transmitters of a legacy. You're right. It's just saying, in this puzzle, because it is a puzzle, there are several items, and we can't deny the relevance of this item. I think that many people misunderstand it and think that it's as if black people did it, and next it left. No, it's been created thanks to the legacy of all the musics we are acquainted with. Zarabanda, chacona, gurumbe, fandangos, which are related to a sort of circular space around the Atlantic Ocean. This is the case of fandango. And as it happens with any other way, I think about musical forms born in London. Without Jamaicans, many things wouldn't sound the way they sound. It goes into the puzzle as one item of it. I think for many it's difficult to accept that there are several stories to share, several roots to share as well. Back to art. In this case, your art, your dancing, your performance, is it a way to keep this legacy alive? Could we say that?
Entonces, es como, yo creo que cuando conocí a...
I feel that when I met Ángel Rosales and his work related to Gurumbe, I met across the scientific evidence of something I felt in my guts, intuitively. I look back now, and I think that my body found something I didn't know. I don't know why flamenco drew me so much attraction from me. For a long time, I didn't appreciate which my place in flamenco was. I judged myself from a standpoint that acknowledged the way I moved until I saw Germain, one flamenco dancer, a black man living in France, and his back was very similar, his spine was very similar to mine. These small moments have been very critical in my realizing that I can carry on what I'm up to now. And now I'm at a time and a place where, yes, I'm looking for giving value, appreciating these things that go into being an African child regarding morals, movements, values, spiritual values. I don't know how to say it. So it's not an imposition on me to say I can't play this role. I'm gonna bear the torch. No, it's more and more of us African children working together and dancing flamenco and getting keen on it. For me, it's this has helped me better understand flamenco. It helped me move my body better in flamenco. When dancing flamenco, that need to have a look at it from a sort of African child's perspective with values that show in several expressions in South Africa. When talking at the beginning about legacies, we always go back to the South. The heritage in the South shows more. The Arab, Moorish legacy shows better with La Alhambra Palace, but in Catalonia it's even more difficult. Those monuments do not exist, and traces are different. It's necessary to look especially for them to understand what that legacy lies. Yes, that's actually, because Catalonia, they master the art of camouflaging these traces. They are very good at it. And there is Gurumbe, a must-see. There is a documentary recently shown on 30 Minutes program TV3 called Negres, showcasing with evidences and facts the presence of Africans in Catalonia, Valencia, and Balearic Isles. The heritage was different in the south versus the north because cultures are different, both places. But for instance, this documentary, I think, is necessary to watch because it places you on the right spot. And suddenly you realize that there is a story you've not been told. Story that's in front of us, i.e., modernism in Catalonia, Art Nouveau, which is national pride for Catalonians. Catalan Art Nouveau buildings such as Liceu Opera House, La Pedrera, Hotel Colonial Hotel, Batlló House, which are the symbols of Catalan pride. It's good and it's necessary to find out, to realize that most of its funding, the patrons, the sponsors who funded these buildings, came from black slave trade from Africa. This is something that's taught nowhere. No universities, no schools teach it. At least as in my case, I don't know, Rahmata, whether you've been told about it. You've studied in Catalonia. No, in Catalonia, no one's ever talked about it. No one's talked about it. They always talk about modernism, Art Nouveau, as Flamenco, as something we own, but they don't tell us the other side of the coin, how this movement was funded, what was going on in history at the time, in parallel to these manifestations of architecture. So I recommend you to watch Negres, the documentary. I also recommend you to have a look at it. Let's switch to Africa now. In Western Africa, oral tradition culture has been kept alive for many generations, partially because of the djelis, griots, even if this term has specificities of its own, some big specificities. I quote Rahmata. In Western Africa, which used to be the empire of Mande or Mali, transmission has totally been oral, thanks to djelis. But internationally, the usual term used for that idea is griot. Griot and djeli refer to the same idea. The origin and the connotations of both words are totally different. Griot is a term coined by the Portuguese that was taken by the French, which means servant of a king in this case. However, djeli comes from Mande language and it means blood. It's something totally different, both the role and the meaning. Colonizers reached Western Africa, met the djelis sitting by the kings and considered them servants. Actually, djelis are not the king's men, but are very important and play a critical social role currently when transmitting history, education, values, traditions, and mediating in disputes and communicating amongst the populations, communities, with kings back then, or authorities, rulers. I do like, for instance, a sentence said by Giovanni Giabate. If the empire of Mali were a human body, the djelis will be the blood of that body. And he's totally right, because they play a social role that's essential. Words are important eventually, and words are important. Yinka, would you like to add anything to it, to the previous issue we were dealing with, related to legacy, African legacy in Catalonia? No. I've not seen Negres, so it is a must for me to see it. However, I think that I am a Londoner. My school was in front of the Natural History Museum, the NHM, and the VAM, the Victoria and Albert Museum, Victoria, the great colonizer queen. I've always been aware that money behind these big monuments came from slave trading and, of course, plantations and slavery themselves. Generally speaking, it's difficult to take this out of the formula of the theoretical European progress. I think it's a fake, trying not to omit it. Therefore, I think that the same relation, and it's very interesting what Núria was saying, blood, djeli, these words, blood. Blood flowing, financial blood flowing. In the West, is highly related to the lives, the effort, the ordeal, the wealth of a continent and its people. And especially let's talk about indigenous American Aborigines who lost their lives. So blood's a very interesting word for me to think about when dealing with this case. It's like the arteries. It's there to help things move on. Back to flamenco and its possible African heritage. We want to catalog things. We want to coin a name that describes everything perfectly. Perhaps this is a topic for which it is necessary to look for something specific. Perhaps we should understand how the process goes and similarities in this process instead of looking for something specific. I quote Yinka at the beginning. Don't know whether you share this idea with me. Yes, I do agree with you on it totally. Myself, I'm not that much into flamenco, but I can tell you that similarities. Not so much things technical, academic, specific. I think that actually they are far more striking and global, e.g. oral transmission within the families, express body gestures, body language. This is it essentially. Things more cultural in character, not so much technical, not so much specific. African heritage is there to stay. Yinka, would you like to add anything? Since I'm not a historian myself, I'm not a musicologist, therefore I find it difficult. What I'm keen on as a person dealing with my body, working with my body, I'm interested in how to look for ways, forms that are embodied in doing things, as Núria said. But I think that there are two things ongoing at the same time. I think that many people would rather listen to Tomás de Perate, a big artist from a big family, a great family of flamenco gypsies. He does talk a lot now of, and he's very keen on and inspired by this African heritage because he himself has it in his own family. Manuel Torre, his grandfather, a big flamenco singer, cantador, and muse of Lorca, has a mother who is colored and who is biracial, and this happens to many other families. So there is a mixture between where African children went to, who were in the territory, and I quote Perrate, and many people talk about it, many musicologists, the relation between the 12-time beat, Núria, please help me out, binary and 3 times 2 at the same time, ternary and binary at the same time. This shows in many musics that went popular by African children from the 15th century, 16th century on, that later gave birth to flamenco. The way I see it, flamenco is but a modern art that appeared in the 1850s in the cities, but built on a previous heritage of popular music in the territory. So I think that on the one hand, we can drag things from the past, but what I think even more interesting is understanding that on the one hand, we talk about people, although there were many free people, actually African children were very low in the hierarchy of the society back then. And frequently they themselves didn't own themselves. So that things are written. It's difficult to look for it there because they were not allowed to sign any records, any documents. But that's why I'm infatuated with the experience of bodily getting into flamenco. There was something striking in it for me that drew my attention. I had the opportunity to work with Zimbabwean Dora Chipamidi and Akram Mare, these artists. It was only then when I realized clearly that the way to reach music, the body, where both things are not dissociated, the way to create in a community, to get supported by a bit, the possibility to affix my own seal to it. These things that are basic values of flamenco fiesta. And in flamenco, we have the big stages, the big theaters, the flamenco ballets. But in the world we think flamenco was created, I think that we should go to the 100% embodied experience. That's where I think it still beats. Let me add to what you say, Yinka, that e.g., the fact that the community is there and supports, and the community is allowed to input into it, not on a big stage, but in a group of people just playing bulerías. Everyone is allowed to input into it, dancing, singing, or clapping hands. In Western Africa, we usually find it everywhere. It's necessary to be a dancer or a musician or a singer, to dance, to music, to do music, to play, to input into this community celebration, into this community party. In Europe, again, our way to consume music is just watching it being done for entertainment purposes. And this community side of it, participation, impromptu side of it, of you just stand up and dance, is there for us as amputated with a cap on it. But in Senegal, for instance, the Sabar ceremonies, it is a real fiesta, a real celebration with everyone, anyone dancing, and the whole community supports you and encourages you, and no one is judgmental of what your performance. It's true. This implies, in my opinion, and I totally agree, and it's with you, frequently this is misunderstood. It is a sort of each one does her own thing. That's not it. There is something shared and known in this time of music that goes into the way things are done. So when entering this space, there is a vocabulary that is shared by those in that space, a vocabulary talked by people there in that celebration. It is a space of creation where the individual adds to the community's knowledge, and this leads to a creation and changes the way things done somehow. Of course, the case of flamenco is that it went academic eventually. We don't learn flamenco so much in these spaces, but we go to the academy for it. However, it's wonderful there is still a link between the big ones. Farroquito, use him dancing bulería with Pastora Galvan. He is great. And with opera, it doesn't happen. You don't see the greatest opera singers in the world in a bar, informally, with his or her cousins playing somehow. I think that flamenco keeps it alive and kicking. Actually, as a space for knowledge, it's not n'importe quoi. It's very specific. It's got its specific codes and language that allow the individual to do his or her own performance in this space. I think that the idea of improvising brings both worlds together, flamenco dancing and the djeli music, the Western African traditional music, a place where you can input something because no one is judgmental, which doesn't happen with traditional music up here. Essentially, back to the djelis and their music and their dancing, It's very simple. The fact that there is no written score in front of you, no written music in front of you, gives you total freedom to go impromptu, to improvise, to input, to reinterpret, to reconceive, to re-engineer on the spot, without the input of the mind controlling you. Here in Europe, we have a musical legacy that has totally been cut in stone, written, coded, recorded, preserved for centuries, forever and ever. But you are given a score, written music, and you can but read it and do what you are told. You can't input into it. However, the djeli tradition in music reading, in playing the kora or the balafon or the dum-dums, they have their code, their repertoire, their tuning systems, and each one has his or her own place to do some impromptu, to improvise spontaneously, always, all the time. And I think this is shared with flamenco. I quote you, improvising. It brings me back to djelis going to a christening, to a celebration, to a wedding. They customize music to that specific event they are attending. They introduce elements to customize it. It's improvised. They don't do it as homework before the fact. No, they are not there making a script as they go, and we've tried ourselves to do. No, they totally improvise and customize to the recipients. When a djeli inputs into a ceremony, he knows which family will be there and who the persons are there. He improvises a song dedicated to these people, telling the history of her ancestors, the feats, their feats, and what the person in front of him did for the benefit of the community, of the family around them. And this is an art, a real craft of improvising. There is also memory in putting into it, a living memory. Back to African art, let's talk about the role played by women. There are many djeli women as well, yes? And they play a critical social role, yes? Within the djeli families, there's the djeli keo, the male djeli, and the djeli muso, the female djeli. Muso's mandinga for women. The social role, traditionally, is that men are empowered to play instruments such as balafon, kora, drums, and singing, and women were limited to singing and banging dry pumpkins for drumming. This changed. Recently, we see women playing balafon, kora, drumming, but it used to be the traditional role of men. Women were pushed down to singing, so they are the big transmitters, the big guardians of the history, of the values, the songs, the genealogies, the lineages, the feats, and the mediators in disputes within a family, within a neighborhood, within a town. And this used to happen in the 13th century. That now happens currently. They still play this critical role in the society, and they are very active and very vocal about it. And each family, for instance, has its own specific djeli. When within the family a child, a girl, a daughter, a son is born, she inherits the family's djeli. And if this person grows up, gets married, has children, the djeli will go there and will tell him or her the story of their parents, ancestors, grandparents. You were talking about women who play the kora. I'm acquainted with Joana Duarte. Could you quote some names for us of women djelis? Joana Duarte is the most famous one internationally. She's doing an impressive, great work herself because she transmits and conveys the djeli art everywhere in the world by singing and playing the kora in Gambia. She's created a school where she teaches music. She empowers girls to create music, and her task is enormous. More women djelis who play kora balafon. are that are famous. Just a few of them. Let me quote, for instance, a band. Can't remember the band's name. Let me Google for it. That's women-based. One plays balafon, one djembe, one sings. There is an electric bass, and the band members are women. Sene Camara, resident in Paris, a singer and kora player. She does a very good work making women surface, women musicians. And in the territory, little by little, girls are empowered to play instruments themselves, to create music, the same way as boys do. It's not usual to have women playing instruments, maybe. It's not as usual as here, for instance. Little by little, however, things change. Earlier, it was almost forbidden for a woman to play instruments, to play her husband's kora or her uncle's kora, her brother's kora. Now, in many djeli families, you realize that the father, who's the official musician because the mother is the singer, wants to teach his sons and daughters. There are more traditional families, though, of course, and more open-minded families. There are many different cases. Yinka, would you like to add anything else before we wrap up? I don't know. This is an infinite topic that could stay with us for hours. Let me stress, back to djelis we're talking about. I'm an African child, but born in England. I'm separated from Ghana, which is my country where my mother was born. It's very strange. For me, flamenco has been one of my ways to reconnect again, because I think interesting stressing how things African later are re-engineered in different territories. I'm half West Indian and as well, and flamenco in Spain makes me think how people in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Jamaica, USA, for me, this case, and we should take into account that in the African continent there have been so many changes in these traditions within this circularity I was talking about earlier. Circularity of wisdoms, of bodies, the ways African people do things. For me, it's like closing by opening new settings at the same time for this thought, this diaspora of Africa. Let me input what you say, Yinka, that this brings me to a quotation by Cantaor Raúl Rodriguez. How come we own that there is Afro-USA music, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Peruvian music and dancing, but we are reluctant to accept Afro-Andalusian music and dancing? How come? I think this word, we should start using it. We should bring some life to it. Of course, you're right, because they were Afro-Andalusians themselves, these people. Let's wrap up. Before we give the floor back to the audience, let's listen to a performance called Mansani by Maiga, a fusion of Boleria and Mandé art. Please play the video for us.
Ole.
A very nice composition. Now the floor goes to the audience for any questions and inputs. Use the mic, please. Any questions, please? Any remarks you'd like to share with us? It's a roving mic for you to use. Any questions, any remarks from the audience? Thank you, the three of you, for your interesting words. It's been suggestive. Two things came to my mind as you talked. I'd like to share with you. First, you were talking about the relevance of words, of expressions. We all talk. You said that they were here for 4 centuries. But in fact, when talking about the Romans who entered Empúries and the fall of the Roman Empire, there is a gap of 6 centuries between both times in history. We acknowledge that we belong to the Roman Empire, that this territory belonged to the Roman Empire, a political, social entity. We acknowledge ourselves as Latins, not as Romans, which is the same. However, Al-Andalus was a social cultural reality that existed for 8 centuries. They entered the peninsula and the kingdom of Granada fell down. Between both times, there is a gap of 8 centuries. They were here in these terms and not the way Romans were with us. We were that. Al-Andalus belonged to a social cultural reality, political reality, that counted in most of North Africa and even the Arabian Peninsula. So they were here with us. We belong to this reality. And there were exchanges. And this went for 100 years. It meant a lot, especially for Andalusia, which was the territory that remained the longest in this reality. This is my idea I'd like to share with you. Next, I don't know how to word it. There is a sort of contradiction in my mind because you were talking about the fact that flamenco, when it went canonical and went systematic and academic as a musical system in the late 19th century, early 20th century, within a phenomenon of positive orientalization. I mean, those songs that were considered to be more authentic, more real, more hondo, more flamenco, are those songs or cantes that are far away from the European canon, that sounds European, that somehow sound as coming from the Levant, from the East, as you said, harmonically, rhythmically speaking. How odd. It strikes me that this phenomenon exists of self-orientalization. At the same time, there is a sort of refusal, historical refusal of the sources, demographic sources, and cultural sources of this type of musical forms that stand out as more flamenco, more authentic. So there is a contradiction, a sort of game of mirrors that contradict one another, saying, yes, we make up an identity by opposition to things European. At the same time, we don't want to acknowledge that what we are up to is feeling for a bigger body that belongs to a cultural reality that we refuse at the same time. I feel that everything boils down to acculturation. I mean, I pick it up, I own it, and I cut the roots where it comes from because I'm not interested in that. It is an acculturation process that is very heavy, substantial, with historical gaps in it, big blanks in it. I quote Rahmata and Yinka. How many people living in Spain in this current society How many are aware of this heritage, of the presence of African people, Moorish people, gypsies, for so many centuries with us? Very few. Yinka, please. The floor goes to you. Thank you for both remarks. I don't know whether we've been clear about it, because I think there is some confusion. When talking about these people, we are separating them from the Andalusi world, which is there in flamenco. And I quote Rahmata, it's been acknowledged. We're talking as well about African children, sub-Saharan African children, who from 1492 on, when this alleged opening to the Atlantic started, even if the Portuguese were before the Spaniards on the African coast, on the occasion of the slave trade, there were African children until the 19th century in towns such as Cadiz, Seville, Huelva. I quote Núria Esi Graves in Catalonia. I think that versus Rome, we as African children, this fact has created relations of power and has created a situation that has changed somehow, but essentially it still perpetuates a totally hierarchical relation. Sorry, Spanish is not my first language. Hence, insisting on this presence. Of course, I totally agree with you that Spaniards were those who were here for 8 centuries. These are not distant people who left and came back. Again, where are these African children? In current Spaniards, living here now with us. Hence the need to re-watch, re-observe our own history. Vis-a-vis flamenco, I think that the case is that it's been very useful thanks to the French romantics who went to Spain, who saw in the quote-unquote gypsy a totally Oriental Levantine approach to gypsies that led as well to something else that shows more, versus the Negro no one wants to be. Africa is 9 miles away from Spain. However, it seems to be at the other side of the ocean. This does mirror how in the images created around flamenco, it's materialized very well, and taking it to India from a very acceptable other versus an other that is not so much acceptable. It's a matter of different standpoints. This is what I wanted to share with you in my message. Do we have time for one more question from the audience? Hi. Thank you very much for your speeches because they are so interesting. Some things came to my mind, and this is my question. First, Núria, you were talking about Catalonia, who's very good at concealing its own origins. Rumba Catalana comes to my mind, and Congolese rumba that comes from Cuban rumba. So the beauty in flamenco, what I like about it is that in Colombia they talk about cante de ida y vuelta, related back and forth cante, round trip cante. This belongs to us, and this comes from everywhere and is brought everywhere. Is the round trip cante. You were talking about the South. I think it is a way of life that shows in many things. Now we talk about the Mediterranean basin, but this concept applies to many regions in the world. The beauty in this conference, in this panel, is that it is so necessary. For instance, when you were dealing with flamenco as a gypsy owned, little is known about the origins of flamenco and gypsies, or a typically Spanish flamenco. We'd better talk about African, Afro-Spanish flamenco, African children's flamenco. Let's do it. The case is that we think about the place where we are now, with a very Europe-centered culture. It is so necessary, anthropologically speaking, to validate these concepts that belong to oral culture, to non-tangible heritage, things that are not written, as Núria said, repeating many things in European arts that are giving back works stolen during colonialism back to the places they were found. In many places, Yinka was talking about the London museums. It is so necessary to do it. We all know that what's not talked about doesn't exist. But we need these appreciations. Do we need them? I see it out of my own curiosity, what Yinka feels when dancing. Do you feel these references, these butterflies in your stomach when dancing? Can you feel them? Is it necessary to talk about it, to voice it? On my side, I think we must, but I need your answers, not mine, to this question. So the question is whether it is necessary to talk about this, to put labels, to label, to coin names for these realities. I think it inputs into a Europe-centered education, labeling things, defining things. When migrations, journeys, trips, cultural exchanges, history, obviously, brings us to other places, to other types of approaches, of thoughts. Yinka, would you like to answer the question? I could talk for hours about it. Thank you for the question, because I promise you, some days ago I was talking with a fellow dancer of mine, Phyllis Akini, an Afro-Ghanaian dancer, and I agree with you that sometimes I personally, I don't want anyone to be convinced of what I do, but personally, it's been necessary. It's been a must for me, because I've attended classes where I've been the only black person in the class. Of course, many teachers did support me a lot. Others were very kind, but couldn't imagine myself as a flamenco dancer because of my black complexion. The way they saw my dancing, my moving, that was judgmental, and I went through it. I felt that approach, that judgmental approach by my teachers. It's been vital in my life. It's been capital. It's those young male and female African children ask where they come from, and it's difficult for them to consider themselves as Spaniards. Let's consider that it's nothing new at all, that it's happened before, that for many centuries. We had a lot to input into the Spanish wealth and the Spanish world and legacy. It's important to stress it. If no one wants to know it, that's okay with me. But for me, versus the rejection we feel, that happened with the impossibility of talking about flamenco as if it were one of the richest ways of Spanish expression that is created thanks to the gypsy input, of course, to the Moorish legacy, the Jewish legacy, we didn't quote it, that goes together with as well the legacy of African children. It's important to stress it because otherwise we are always rejecting black things, African things. The USA would make us think that rock and roll wasn't created by the forms of expression of Afro-Americans if they were not there saying that, because rock and roll equals Afro-American presence in the USA. So I agree with you, but being scientific about the labeling, but what I try to convey is that even if it's done for many centuries, please, no more pretending we've never been there, we have nothing to input, because it is a big lie. A lie that hits politics as well. The idea of people thinking, what are these people doing here? What are they here for? So I think it is a must to factor it in, especially for our benefit, to feel that we are taking a very strong stance. Let me add to what you said about labeling things. This is not necessary, but what's necessary is informing, showing, showcasing. It doesn't matter whether it's a label on it or not. Just updating, circulating information, because if you're not aware of that, you can't even identify where you come from and what's happened in your own history. You can't correct, you can't review, you can't be aware of the relevance to change the future. So we perpetuate the same history that is always one and written from one single standpoint. We need different stories from different points of view in order to have a more complete approach to history in Spain and abroad. So let's wrap up. Thank you for attending this panel. Thank you very much, those of you online. Thank you for listening to us.